Maybe put it to this side, please. Yeah, just because the lighting is on that one. Although it's not, we're not able to see it. It's good for all the photos. Yeah. See what you can do. You can see what you can do. Where Shed Heaven says that's good. So yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Baroness Hale, Lady Chief Justice, guests, sponsors, colleagues. My name is Professor Joan Loughrey, and I am head of the School of Law here at Queen's University Belfast. And it is my great pleasure and privilege to welcome you all here this morning to this celebration of women in law, and sponsored by the First 100 Years. The First 100 Years is a wonderful initiative, and I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity to host this event here at Queen's University Belfast and to welcome Dana and her team here to Northern Ireland and to Belfast. I remember when it first began in 2014, feeling really inspired by the stories of the groundbreaking, glass ceiling busting women it celebrated. The stories were powerful and they were oftentimes moving. And it is apt that we are able to celebrate 10 years of the project here at Queen's in Belfast, because the Law School at Queen's is one of the sites of the milestones in the first 100 years. In 1972, the Law School at Queen's appointed the first woman law professor in the UK when they appointed Professor Claire Pally to the school. We still have the Claire Pally scholarship for students who get the best mark in law and gender in a dissertation or in a project, so we are still celebrating her memory today. We are also very proud that our alumni were the first women to be appointed to the High Court in Northern Ireland, namely Our Lady Chief Justice, Dame Siobhan Keegan, and our Judge in Residence, Madam Justice McBride. And we are very proud that our alumna, the Lady Chief Justice, was the first female Chief Justice in the UK. In addition, this year saw the school achieve the Silver Athena Swan accreditation for our work on gender equality. And it was led by our Swan champion, Professor Aoife O'Donoghue, who you're going to be hearing from later. The university itself achieved the Gold Athena Swan Award, and we are hugely proud as a school and as an institution for our work on gender equality. But it is clear that for progress to continue, because it's very easy for progress to be lost, that we need to keep working at gender equality. And that's why the next 100 Years project is so important, and why I'm really pleased to welcome it here to Queen's. I do want to say thank you to Dana Denis-Smith and to the First 100 Years, and to NL Goodbody and to Danske Bank, who are sponsoring the event, for giving us the opportunity to host this here today. Thank you very much. And now, without further ado, I will welcome Dana to the stage. Dana, over to you.
Well, thank you so much. This is wonderful. I think about 12 hours ago, we were not quite sure we will be standing here today, so I am thrilled. Beyond, I cannot explain how happy I am that we ventured through all types of weather and we showed the strength that women in law have. We made it. So I take a lot of inspiration from the pioneers, and to be honest, when I started the first 100 years, it was November 2013, and I was kind of writing a bit of a story, if you like, around this concept of first woman, but very much in one chapter, if you like. So for me, I discovered the 1919 Act, the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, which basically paved the way for women coming into the legal profession across the UK, Ireland, and actually the Commonwealth, where this disqualification applied. And I decided I wanted to unearth the stories of the first women that had been forgotten to history and, share this timeline. So it's very much a first 100 years timeline with very important moments. We built it up over a first year of research, and I thought that would be it. We will just unearth these stories. They're powerful. They show how long and how long we've been around and how hard we've worked to be here. But to my amazement, the discovery, apart from realizing, as I always say, that it wasn't a historic research project, it was very much an archaeological dig, because we could hardly find anything. We had to dig really deep to find information about the first woman. I also found the exciting moment, I think, of the project was discovering that a lot of the first women were still with us. So history was being made in our lifetime. And as somebody who grew up under communism, I am a big witness to history, if you like, because I think that kind of moment of change, of really witnessing it happen, is a really special moment that we need to record. So I became a bit of a kind of recording enthusiast, and I photograph everything and video everything. And so with that in mind, we decided to film the biographical stories, the life and work of all the women firsts that we had with us since 2014. And I'm so thrilled the two of them are in the room. So that is really, really special. And that you can see about how different the story of women rising has been in terms of where they started. Somebody at one point said, well, do you need to be a baroness to qualify to be in your project? And I said, no, that's the end of the story. The start is very different, and I think that's where the power of the project is, to show there's different ways to start. But the destination can be one of success, but you need to define your own path. So that was the first, and I thought the only chapter of the project. The first 100 years is spiraled out of control almost, I think, in a good way, where the biographical films we thought we will make then became, I think, and it culminated in our commission that went up into the Supreme Court to really, if you like, mark the walls of history with the images of women in law throughout that journey that we traced over the project's time. And then lockdown came, and I thought I was done and I could rest a little and not move on with the next chapter. And then we realized the work wasn't done, because although we've learned a lot about the different routes into the profession, we realized they paved the way. They really changed the future for women in law, but there were certain structural and very stubborn barriers that remain. And we wanted to make sure we carry forward the work we did and we learned from the past to really shape for the next generation what they inherit from us, because I think we have a responsibility to leave a better place for those coming behind. So the next 100 years was born. But to my delight, the first kept coming. So in March 2020, we launched the next 100 years. And then promptly we had 2021 first. And then we obviously had a first last year with our own English Lady Chief Justice, Baroness Carr. And then even this year we had the first Muslim Lord Chancellor who chose to call herself Lord, which is also allowed. So that's fine. And so we have really seen that actually the story of the first continues. There were still first to be recorded for women in law, and we are going to continue to film those stories and make sure they remain a record for future generations. Equally, we spend a lot of time looking at future-focused issues around, for example, technology and whether women are being left behind by AI, or the caring responsibilities, preventing women from rising to the top. What are the sticky issues that we can now shift by being very, very focused on them? So that's very much the spirit of the next 100 years. But as I said, because what we've learned from the first women is that they always pave the way for the next generation, even when maybe they didn't really realize. But actually, when you read some of the early stories, they felt the importance of their act. They knew that by pushing the door open, they were going to open the way for other women. So they've always been very clear that they are paving a path for future generations. So our latest project is our own Paving the Way campaign. So we want to sponsor 30 scholars to help them, not with their studies, which is obviously very important financial support in the climate today, but very importantly to focus their research in the final year of education on the contribution of women to the legal world, whether it's through their legal research or their legal contribution in terms of, jurisprudence, let's say, or from a historic point of view. We really are giving them the opportunity to expand how they want to research this subject, but we want to continue to talk about the contribution of women to the legal profession in a wider sense. So in that regard, I will play you a very, very, very short video, because we are a video project after all, and then I shall introduce our first speaker.
Women did not become barristers. I was the first black woman to take, so it was a surreal feeling.
Nobody in my family had ever done anything like that before.
I've been able to break that glass ceiling.
Getting silk was the best day of my life.
It was just all tremendously exciting.
I just would like the next generation to find it easier and also to make better progress.
Keep your head up and plow on, and you'll win in the end.
Law is supposed to be about justice, fairness, and equality.
So that is our, third chapter, I guess, in the project. My book is getting longer by the year. But before I move us along, I wanted to also talk a little bit about somebody that's very special to the project. And she's not in the room tonight. She is the one woman in the middle of the photograph I discovered in November 2013, which made a lot of my kind of doubts about the role of women in law really crystallized into the first 100 years. And that was a photograph from Herbert Smith, which actually was delivered to my husband, but he took no notice, but I did, because among about 60 men celebrating the history of the firm, I think 150 years, all the partners in the firm at the time, this was 1982, there was just the one woman in the middle. And she was dressed in blue, at least that's what the photograph seemed to show. And it really captivated me that in 1982, there was just the one and only partner in a major law firm. And I felt that really told me something very deep around where we came from, but also why we were still where we were. I felt that context of the struggle we still feel we have, although women are the majority in the legal profession, really was captured by that photograph. So that photograph really stirred me into action. So before we move on today, I just wanted to share with you that Dorothy Livingston, the woman in the middle, the inspiration behind this project, we lost her in the last few days. And I just wanted to share that news because I know she was a great inspiration to me and a really critical player in the creation of this project. And I hope you will all remember her name, Dorothy Livingston. And although our strapline says we're paving the way, really I think we are continuing to pave the way because others have done it for us. And my favorite quote from Lady Hale, who is with us today, is always the reference not to the first, but the first for opening the doors for the second and the others coming behind. And how grateful she was always to the ones that were first because they made the possible for those coming behind. So our first guest of today is none other than Lady Hale, who is being recognized everywhere, including on the Derry flight. And so I'm thrilled because she has been an incredible champion and supporter and really made me believe that we should not stop and keep going with this project, even at times when really taking a good nap is a better option. And so I'm really, really thrilled that we could welcome her here in Belfast today. And she, I think, has so many firsts. I won't name them, but I do urge you to watch our film of her life and work to understand how it all became the story that most of us know today. She has paved the way for so many women, including generations before her, who have paid the respects for the inspiration she provided to save Baroness Butler-Ross, who said she really took inspiration from the generation coming behind. So I think the best words will come by hearing from her next. So, Lady Hell.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a delight, actually, to be in Belfast. Dana and I must be the only people who have travelled from London to Belfast via Derry. But it's great to be here. It's great to be back in this lovely place where I was last here to deliver a lecture in honour of Mary McAleese. And I think I talked about women and equality in the law then. I think I had a 10-point plan, but I can't remember what it was. But there we are. It's a great delight to be here again because, of course, you are the first part of the United Kingdom to have a Lady Chief Justice, so it's lovely to see you here today. We've only just caught up. It was inspiring at the opening of the legal year in Westminster Abbey and at the Lord Mayor's dinner for the judges to have both a Lady Chief Justice and a woman Lord Chancellor. I think it's a shame she doesn't call herself Lady Chancellor, but there we are. I'm going to talk about England and Wales and the history and the progress in England and Wales because I feel perfectly sure that the Lady Chief Justice will be able to talk about Northern Ireland. And of course, we've been brought here by the First 100 Years Project and the Next 100 Years projects inspired by the wonderful Dana Denis-Smith. I'm grateful to her, not only for her work in celebrating and promoting the achievement of women lawyers, but also, as she touched upon, in raising the funds for a splendid artwork. I do urge you, if you ever come to London, do come and visit the Supreme Court. It's a beautiful building. The only problem with it is that it's full of portraits of dead white men. And this is because we had to take over the collection of portraits from what used to be Middlesex County Council because it was the Middlesex Guildhall. So we were very anxious to do something about that. And Dana was able to facilitate a wonderful artwork that there is there, which celebrates the past, present, and future of women in the law. You know, beginning with the first woman to study law at Oxford, going on to Rose Heilbronn, whom I'm going to say quite a bit about. Then, unfortunately, there's me there. And then, and I am so glad to hear that I'm not the end of the story, despite what you said. Yeah. And then there's the unknown woman lawyer of the future, of whom there are a lot, of course, in this room. So it's a wonderful piece of work. So thank you. Now, of course, the first 100 years was set up to celebrate 1919, to celebrate 2019, which was the centenary of the Sex Disqualification Removal Act of 1919, which allowed women to qualify as lawyers, serve as magistrates, and eventually as judges, to collect their stories and celebrate their achievements. But it is very easy to forget how slow the progress was for the first 50 years. We could celebrate the first women called to the bar and admitted as solicitors, and even the first woman QCs, but there were still very few women practicing law. By 1970, so that's 50 years after the Act, only 803 out of more than 24,000 practicing solicitors were women. Isn't that astonishing? And only 145 out of around 2,500 practicing barristers were women. I was one of them, having been called to the bar in 1969. I don't think I realised then just how few of us there were. All the Manchester chambers, I was in Manchester, a very progressive city, had at least one woman, and I was the second to join my set of chambers. So, as I always say, I am very grateful to those first women whom I have followed in my career, who did not pull up the drawbridge or frighten the horses. I'm the one who frightened the horses, I think, more to that. So, but I was very lucky because I was practicing on the Northern Circuit, following the great role model of Rose Heilbronn. But there was still opposition to overcome. my pupil master told me that he didn't approve of women at the bar, though his wife was a doctor. So I asked him why that was. Well, I plucked up courage, after some months to ask him. And he said, well, that's easy. Medicine is a caring profession, and women both can and should care. But the bar is a fighting profession, and women neither can nor should fight. It made me think about it. He was right about the bar. You have to know when to fight and when not to fight. It's true as solicitors. If you're advocates, you have to know, litigators, you have to know that. But of course, he was totally wrong about women, as is evidenced by the women in this room. And when I was started out at the bar in Manchester, women were not full members of the bar mess. We could only come on ladies' night, when not very many of the men came. We had a grand meeting to try and decide whether to admit women to this was in late 1969. And the meeting would have agreed to allow us into all of the bar messes apart from Grand Night. Grand Night obviously was the one where they told all the dirty stories, and they thought that women couldn't take it. Well, there we go. They just didn't know what women talked about when they were... So the opponents to having us at all pressed for a postal vote. So it was agreed there would be a postal vote. And of course, the postal vote canvassed the whole of the Northern Circuit bar, including all the sensible people who hadn't got to the meeting, and we got through and into everything. So we were, on the whole, pioneers in being accepted as fully equal members of the bar in the Northern Circuit. But Rose only became leader of the circuit long after she should have done. Of course, in 1949, Rose was one of the first 2 women QCs, it was KCs when she first became one, in England and Wales. Margaret Kidd was the first in Scotland the year before, but she had been the only advocate at the Scottish bar from 1920, I think, when she qualified, for ages and ages and ages. I don't know how she did it. And Rose was also the first woman to become a regular judge as part-time recorder of Burnley. But we had to wait until 1962. That's the year before I went up to read law in Cambridge for the first woman county court judge, full-time judge. She was promoted to the High Court in 1965, followed by Rose in 1974. But they were both put in the family division, although they were not family practitioners. Can't trust the women with the big stuff. The first woman to be assigned to the Queen's Bench division was in 1992, and to the Chancery division, and we saw her in the film, Dame Mary Arden, in 1993. And I was only the 10th ever in 1994. And I was the second to the Court of Appeal in 1999, and the first and only to the House of Lords in January 2004. That's 85 years into the first 100. Don't you think that's shocking? What took them so long? Now, I had been aware of negative views about women in the law when I started out. That's why I quoted my pupil master. But I did expect that they might have gone by 2004. So I was rather surprised to read the diaries of Lord Hope of Craighead, a Scottish law lord. His entry for the 31st of December 2003, anticipating the arrival of 3 new law lords on the law lords corridor, said that the atmosphere would change. Well, Simon Brown will keep up the spirit of good humour on the corridor, which of course he would. And Bob Carswell will fit neatly into Brian Hutton's shoes as our man from Northern Ireland, which he did. And Brenda will be a source of some anxiety until we adjust to the very different contribution she will make. I don't know where he got that idea from. I suspect that it was actually directed more at me personally than at women in general, because I have never made any secret of calling myself a feminist, and I was thought to have a Brenda agenda. This was to advance women in the law and on the bench. I doubt whether he was alone in his view, but most colleagues were relaxed. Lord Hoffman said, when I persuaded the doorkeepers, some of you will know that in the House of Lords, the law lords, the bar used to sort of gather in the corridor looking to a door through which the law lords came in single file, and then they progressed into the committee room where we sat. And as we came out through this door, the doorkeepers would walk ahead of us shouting, "Their lordships." And I persuaded them to shout, "Their lordships and her ladyship," which is very kind of them. And Lord Hoffman whispered to me the first time it happened, "Well done, Brenda." So, Lord Hope also revealed that even in 2013, some of my colleagues were not keen on my succeeding him as Deputy President of the Supreme Court, although it had traditionally gone to the most senior serving justice, which was me. They were much more welcoming when I became President in 2017. Perhaps they had then become reconciled to my many character defects. But I have to say, those leadership roles, which are the ones that I have had, I've had leadership roles not in the judiciary, but they were the ones. I was liaison judge for London in the family division, but those are the leadership roles that I have had as a judge. And frankly, they are nothing like as difficult as all the others in the justice systems of England, Wales and Northern Ireland. I don't want to speak about Scotland because it's a very different place. The Lady Chief Justice of England and Wales has responsibility for the whole of the justice system of England and Wales and the judiciary, and they are in a parlous state, as you have probably read. And she is having huge battles to try and secure enough resources to be able to make a dent in the huge backlog that we have got in the criminal justice system. But we've also got it in the family justice system, possibly slightly less in the civil justice system. So that's a huge job, for which I admire her hugely. And it's a huge job to be Lady Chief Justice of Northern Ireland as well, because again, it's comprehensive responsibility for the whole system. So I want to give a shout out to those wonderful women who are prepared to take on those responsibilities, because to some extent it's a thankless task. So thank you very much indeed. By the time I joined the top court in 2004, things had changed dramatically. Of course, women had begun studying law in large numbers in the 1970s and 1980s. After they'd given up sort of thinking about being teachers and doctors and healthcare workers generally, the law was the next thing they turned to, which is interesting, isn't it? Why was that? But they did. The proportions becoming practicing solicitors and barristers steadily increased. By 2000, more than 36% of practicing solicitors, 29% of practicing barristers. But this didn't reflect the numbers being admitted or called to the bar. As in all professions, and it's already been mentioned, there is an attrition rate at 15 to 20 years seniority. Women were still grossly underrepresented at the top of each profession, both as QCs and equity partners in solicitors' firms and in the judiciary. So this century, there was still plenty of room for improvement, but real progress has been made. Women are now 40% of barristers and 53% of solicitors. I'm sure you'll get the figures for Northern Ireland later. This is in England and Wales. And 77% of chartered legal executives, and that tells you something, doesn't it? They're now 38% of the court's judiciary and 52% of the tribunal's judiciary, which I think is a great thing. Actually, the tribunal's judiciary has been much more successful with diversity than the court's judiciary. Positive efforts were taken by a former senior president of tribunals to achieve this. And both on gender and ethnicity, they tend to map the proportions in the working population. Actually, in gender, slightly above that. So it's an example to us all. There's a tendency in the court's judiciary to look down on the tribunal's judiciary. I look up to them. I think in many respects they have a harder job to do, and they do it with diligence and dedication and without making too much of a fuss about it. Yeah. But there is still a seniority problem. Women are only 21% of KCs, 35% of partners, which is not much better than it was at the beginning of the century, and 30% of the higher judiciary, and there are only 2 in the Supreme Court. But I think that much of the improvement was due to the recognition that there was a problem and taking steps to address it. You know, for a long time, people just didn't think it was a problem. They thought it would all sort itself out, you know, things would trickle up and so on. Of course, the first step is counting. We mustn't forget how recent it is that people actually counted how many women and other less advantaged groups there were in particular bits of the profession and the judiciary. The next, of course, is to have an independent judicial appointments commission, which can attract applications, you know, and try and assess merit in an objective way. I'm not saying they succeed necessarily, but they try. Replacing the old tap on the shoulder method of Lord Chancellor's patronage. The trouble with the tap on the shoulder, apart from the serious risk of bias, whether conscious or unconscious, personal preferences, is to have to know whose shoulder to tap. I well remember when I first started out as a High Court judge, the Lord Chancellor's officials would come round and talk to all the High Court judges every year with the list of the silks and ask us who we thought ought to be appointed to the High Court. Well, that's what I mean about knowing whose shoulders to tap. It's a recipe for just going round the same old circle. So it was very, very important to have these independent appointments commissions, and also for the bar to take over the appointment of silks, because that was done by the Lord Chancellor as well. And you can imagine. And now it's done by the bar in, again, a merit-based applications process. So there was a lot to celebrate in 2019, but there is still a great deal to do, which is why I'm so glad that we've got the next 100 Years project. I still hear horror stories of discrimination in briefing practices at the bar. Clerks who deliberately steer work away from women. Clerks who charge their women barristers out at much lower fees than they charge their men for just the same work. Men who load their diaries with more than they can manage, while the women are more conscientious and only take on the work that they think that they can do. There's still a very substantial gender pay gap for the same work at the bar. I don't know what it's like here. I hope it's not the same here. But, and of course, this whole system here is different, so that's why it'd be interesting to see whether it works that way. You don't have clerks, for a start. And clerks are a large part of the problem of women at the bar, as you may have gathered. There are still far too few women appearing in the Supreme Court. Of all the many barristers, and it felt like hundreds, although it wasn't, who appeared in the first of the two cases brought by Mrs. Miller, only one on her feet was a woman. She was extremely good, but there was only one. And of course, in the second case, there were no women on their feet. Mind you, there were far fewer, so. Both barristers' chambers and solicitors' practices can make it difficult for women to take a career break and return. Solicitors' practices with a long hours culture, which is impossible to combine with family life. So many women move sideways into employed practice. The government legal service, local authorities, regulators, commerce, finance and industry. And a very good thing too, 60% of in-house counsel in those jobs are women, and they often reach the top because it's much more manageable. So I think that I would never call those in self-employed practice independent and those in employed practice not independent. They're all independent. So I talk about the self-employed and the employed. And I think we should embrace that terminology because it is so demeaning to those in employed practice to suggest that they are less independent than those in self-employed practice. So we need to recognize the value of this experience in judicial appointments. And of course, we have one shining example of that in Lady Rose, who for a while was the only woman on the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, because she started out at the bar and then went into the government legal service, then went into the parliamentary clerks, variety of tribunal appointments, and then went to the Chancery Division. So she shows that it can be done through a different route. If we are serious about attacking the attrition problem, that's one of the things that women should definitely think about. I hope the next 100 years is going to concentrate to some extent on that. And we shouldn't forget, finally, the intersectional problems. Where gender intersects with race, life becomes even more difficult. Black women barristers are the lowest paid of all the groups of barristers. Court staff may have got used to women advocates, but they can still assume that a young black woman appearing in the room is the defendant rather than the barrister. So that's why the Next 100 Years project is so important. We need to continue to celebrate the achievements of women in the law, but also to recognise the obstacles to their doing even better and work even harder to tackle them. So, thank you. And now I'm going to hand over to somebody who needs absolutely no introduction to this audience, the Lady Chief Justice of Northern Ireland, from September or October 2021. Taking over at a really difficult time to take over, but of course I remember her as one of the women advocates who did appear in the Supreme Court, and we're very, very proud of you, and it's lovely to have you here, and I'm sure you're going to fill in all the stuff about Northern Ireland that I couldn't do. So, over to you.
Well, good morning to all of you. What a great event this is. It's lovely to see so many faces, members of the bar, students as well. Welcome. Hopefully I can fill in some of the gaps after Lady Hale's inspiring talk, but before I do, thanks to Dana for facilitating this along with Queen's and our sponsors. These conversations are really important. I don't think even 10 years ago that we were having these types of conversations in a progressive way in Northern Ireland. But in the past 10 years, we certainly have. And that's always down to the drive and energy of individuals. I see Bridget Napier here, who was president of the Law Society a number of years ago, who put gender equality and diversity as one of her priorities when she was president of the Law Society. And I see representatives of the bar, current chair of the bar, Dana Denis-Smith, here as well, who also keeps this on the agenda. So what I was going to do was start with a few personal reflections. I was told to do this. I recommend Lady Hale's book to you, which is going to be much more interesting, I'd say, than what I have to say. But I do think it's important to, probably mostly for the young people in the room, to tell you where I came from. And to, I suppose, start with this. You know, I was a student at Queen's. I sat at lectures in rooms like this and listened to inspiring people. None of them were women. I didn't think I would be the Lady Chief Justice when I was sitting in the room listening, but there you are, I am. So no pressure to any of you, but I hope one of you, perhaps, in the years to come, in the not too distant future, may continue your careers and think about senior positions. So, where did I come from? Well, as you may know, I grew up in Newry, County Down, which is about 38 miles from Belfast. And I think it's important to tell you, and it's something that when I call the new call to the bar, which is quite unique in Northern Ireland because the Chief Justice calls everybody each year, the parents all come up and ask me, did you have connections, as it's called in Northern Ireland, to get into law? No, I didn't. So I didn't come from a legal background in terms of my family. We had a grocery store. But that stood me in good stead, and I'll tell you one story about that. This probably broke all the rules about employment of children, but you can imagine my parents were quite keen to utilise the 2 children they had in the shop, and it was a family business. And 1983, so I'm working out that I'm about 12, 13. Now, I hasten to add, I was supervised, but in 1983, I remember in the shop, and we had a lot, it was a traditional store, we had a lot of elderly people coming into the shop. So 1983 was the year that pound coins were introduced, and there was an old lady in the shop. My dad was looking over my shoulder, and he said, "Okay, Siobhan, you deal with this lady." I was giving her change, and she couldn't understand why I wasn't giving her pound notes. You know, that started a system within our business of me having to explain and take time to explain that there was a change, and these pound coins weren't pennies, which is what she thought they were. And lo and behold, I think what I got there was the ability to step into a quasi-authoritative position from an early age. So I really thank my parents. I thank my parents for that. But at school, you know, again, let's you know, celebrate what we have in Northern Ireland, which is an excellent education system. So the ability to go to really good schools here is open to all. I benefited from that. And the careers teacher, as many of you might have experienced, said, well, you're good at history and geography and English literature, and you're good at debating. So why don't you be a teacher? Why don't you go for teaching? There's nothing wrong with teaching. And I actually did go for an interview to St. Mary's College for teaching. And I remember that the interviewer said to me, you know, you've no problem teaching, you can get in here. But have you not considered law? And I had it in the background, and I'm really glad I took up law. It's a very dynamic subject matter. It takes a while, just to say to the students in the room, to understand the language of law. It provides discipline, it gets you thinking, and it's not something I ever regretted doing. But the other, you know, aspects of law which were important to me and remain important to me as I continue throughout my career are the organisations that I became involved in, ancillary or at the sidelines. So I was president of the Students' Law Society at Queen's, which was, and I see some presidents in the room, we actually had a celebration of past presidents. There are some people who came back from the 1950s, which was brilliant, recently at Queen's. So that was important. Why that's important is peer support. For me, peer support remains one of the reasons why I can continue to have an equilibrium in my own life, and I think feel a support within the legal system. And we're lucky in Northern Ireland as well in relation to that. So, peer support, family support, we'll probably talk a little bit about that later on in the panel discussion. After graduating from Queen's, so I was in Queen's from 1989 to 1983, and I went direct to the Institute to take my qualification to the bar in 1994. So I came to the bar, and my master was a civil law master, which was a brilliant education for me. One of his words of wisdom to me whenever I started in pupillage was, don't do any family law. So there you go. Whenever these things happen in my life, if somebody says don't do something, I tend to do the opposite. But it wasn't just a stubbornness on my part to take on family law. It was the fact that in 1995, the Children Northern Ireland Order was enacted and was implemented in 1996 following the Children Act in 1989. So I actually did make a choice to take on cases which dealt with family matters, and actually those cases got me into the higher courts at a much earlier age than I think I would have been in those courts, right up to the House of Lords and the Supreme Court by undertaking really important work within the family law arena, which also obviously engages convention arguments. So I do fly the flag for family law, albeit I also get somewhat frustrated when it's suggested that there's some hierarchies in terms of divisions within our court system. I don't believe there are. But I also think that whatever you choose, the key is transferability of skills. And I hope I've demonstrated that, because keeping going with my trajectory, I became a silk in 2006, and then I became a judge, as you've heard, in 2015. And my silk practice was varied, so I didn't just practice in family law. I undertook some crime, but mostly judicial review is another aspect of the work that I was interested in. And I do remember appearing in front of Lady Hale twice. And I do remember, firstly, the House of Lords, and she's talked about the grandeur of the corridor and the barristers waiting anxiously and the Lords coming out. And I also remember a painting which was above the Law Lords in the committee room in which we sat, which appeared to be a historical figure being slayed. Lady Hale will know exactly who this was. That was not indicative of our argument. We actually did end up winning the case, but of course, all of the questions that were focused and really hit the nail on the head came from Lady Hale. It was the first family law case to go to the House of Lords in 25 years in relation to freeing for adoption, which I have to say, regretfully, is still on the books here. Anyway, and then my second outing was in the Supreme Court in an international Hague case, which again was energizing and challenging, as it should be. And you should all, if you're lawyers, aspire to appearing in the Supreme Court, which is our apex court. And you can watch online, of course, now and see how cases progress. But, so when I came to the bar and when I was a silk, so I've told you the sort of milestones, 1994, 2006, there weren't very many senior women in the judiciary, if any. First female judge in Northern Ireland to achieve office in the county court was Her Honour Judge Corinne Philpott. That was 1998, so that was 4 years after I came to the bar. And we have progressed since then, but I think it's quite a startling figure in terms of our history, that it was 1998 for Judge Philpott and 2015 for myself and Judge McBride. Now, why that I think is significant is because of how that wasn't reflective of the complexion of the profession. The Law Society wasn't, I think, greatly in a better position in terms of advancement of women. So some of the statistics I have by way of illustration in Northern Ireland are these, that when the Law Society was established in 1922, there were no women on the roll of solicitors. Indeed, the Sex Disqualification Removal Act, which removed the legal impediment to women working as lawyers, as you've heard, had only been passed a few years earlier, so perhaps that's not surprising. But things did start to change in early 1923 when Mary Dorothea Heron, a native of Downpatrick and a graduate of Queen's, was the first woman to be admitted as a solicitor on the island of Ireland, 1923. I was really privileged to be part of a group that unveiled a really impressive portrait of Dorothea Heron recently, which is in the Law Society building. And I think that was a good marker. But I'm not sure that Dorothea Heron's career progress was that stellar. That's nothing to do with her ability. That's to do with opportunity. And that's to do with, I think, the social support for women progressing at that time. So you won't see much progress for many years. Save this, the Law Society then, through its presidency, started to think about women, and I think progressed quicker than the bar to have, I think, Bridget, you were the 10th female Law Society president, the first being back in the 1970s. So, you know, the Law Society were a bit ahead of the bar in relation to women's progression as solicitors. So you've probably heard about Frances Kyle and Avril Deverell before. I never tire of speaking about them. Whenever I call new barristers to the bar, you sign a roll, and the book that you sign has their signatures in it from 1921. And I show some people this, because first women to be called as barristers in Northern Ireland. In 1928, the Derry Sentinel, or London Derry Sentinel, as I think it was at the time, reported that Avril became the first Irish woman barrister to appear before the Privy Council in London. She was also the first woman to appear in the Supreme Court of Ireland and the Court of Criminal Appeal in Ireland. So these were early pioneers. They were part of a very small trickle. They did have some support at the start of their careers, but again, a bit like Dorothea Heron, I don't think you see it as being a stellar rise for them, because it was difficult. And there were difficult times in any event socially. So it's important to remember the history. It's important to remember how difficult things were. If you're interested in this, in our jurisdiction, if you read Sir Anthony Hart's book about the history of Northern Ireland, he talks further about people who came to the bar, you know, the Silks who came. There's a lovely photograph in the bar of Silks in the late 60s who were called first women, and you've got there Eilish McDermott, who's still practicing. You've got a woman called Mary Lenihan, who became Mary McAleese, President of Ireland. So they have had much more difficult times than I think my generation did in terms of getting traction. But particularly with Eilish, she has stayed the course and appeared last week in front of me in the Court of Appeal. So let's remember the history. That's why this project is so important. It sets out the history on record across jurisdictions. I think our jurisdiction has been slow to really achieve change. I don't think change has been quick enough even now, and so we have more to do. Why we have more to do is, if you look at the current statistics, the majority of law undergraduates in Northern Ireland and at the Institute of Professional Legal Studies are women. 51% of solicitors are now female, 49% male. That actually exactly reflects the gender balance shown in the 2021 census. 39% of barristers are female. Now that might sound all right, but when we break those high-level figures down further, I don't think they're quite so encouraging. When it comes to partners in solicitors' firms, 42% are noted as female, and at the senior bar, 22% of King's Counsel are female. In real terms, those are statistics that should increase. Looking back to my own experience, of the 18 people who were called to the bar with me in 1994, 11 remain in independent practice, 9 men and 2 women. 3 of the 11, all men, are King's Counsel. And I think this microcosm is illustrative of the bigger picture. We in Northern Ireland continue to have an attrition rate for women in the legal profession which strikes at between 7 and 14 years post-qualification. And the Law Society have set this out in some recent work that they've done, which is very helpful. And this evidence shows that mid-career migration of females out of private practice and into other areas of legal employment and out of the legal sector entirely is part of the trajectory. So, while it is not statistically a significant sample, the professional fate of those in my own year of call to the bar, I think, provides a reasonable real-world snapshot of where we are. Work done by the Law Society that I've mentioned and the bar tells us that the causes of this include a lack of maternity and post-maternity support, a lack of flexible working and other supports for those with caring responsibilities, including elder care, a lack of reward in comparison to male counterparts, and the perceived preferential treatment of male colleagues, including when it comes to promotion. There is also anecdotal evidence that women can feel pigeonholed into the areas of law to which they are perceived to be better suited by reason of gender, such as family law, and they find it harder than men to build legal practices in fields which remain male-dominated, such as criminal law. I don't think there's any easy answer to this, but I think we need to continue with the conversation to ensure that barriers present are understood and are not carried through into future generations. I've talked about how we do that. I think personal and professional support from colleagues is crucial throughout anyone's career, and mentoring schemes, informal or formal, are a very valuable support tool and have been really successful in Northern Ireland. Just before I came to the bench, there was a Women in Law programme set up by my predecessor who was deeply committed to diversity issues within the judiciary, which was really important. And as part of that, I undertook a lecture series which was called Interfaces in Law. And that was for family practitioners to tell everyone about their experience of the interface between family law and criminal law, family law and judicial review, family law and chancery law. It's across the board. What practitioners couldn't understand is why they weren't, if they were briefed in a non-accidental injury case in the High Court in a family law context, why they weren't briefed in the criminal case as well. And frankly, I still don't really, truly understand that myself. It isn't all doom and gloom. In February this year, I presided over the KC call in Northern Ireland, and our system here is that I undertake that selection exercise with the help of the Bar and the Law Society. And we did make history with this because I called 34 new senior counsel on that occasion, 12 women, highest ever number, and 22 men, and also from across a wide range of practice areas. I see at least one of the new silks in the room, so hopefully that sets a standard that will be repeated in years to come, because it just reflects the legal profession that we have. And of course, each person coming forward for promotion in this way gets it on merit alone, and has attained the necessary standard of excellence in their particular area of law. And actually in Northern Ireland, we have more female senior counsel than ever working in our courts. There's a growing number of female partners in solicitors' practices. We have increasing numbers of women holding senior roles within the Law Society and the Bar and within the public sector. And one other thing I'd just like to mention is the visibility of women in senior leadership positions in Northern Ireland. I think we perhaps have suffered in the past in terms of the perception of advancement here or progression. But look what we've got. We've got a First Minister and a Deputy First Minister who are both female. We have an Attorney General who's female, the head of the Civil Services here, who's also a female. Our Justice Minister is a female. So, you know, I think we're doing all right in terms of showcasing that women can be in senior leadership. If you're interested, and I'm not suggesting you are, but I undertook a project with Queen's a number of years ago, which was entitled "You Cannot Be What You Cannot See," and it was commissioned by Queen's with a private individual who was brilliant, actually, because she was non-law, and she said, write a letter to your younger self, which I wasn't really quite sure how I was going to do that. She also said, can we have a photograph of your graduation? And I said, I don't have a photograph, but my mother does. And she said, well, I'll go round to your mother's house in Uri. So she actually did do this and had a job wrestling the photograph off my mother. But we got a copy and it's up in Queen's. But why I tell you the story is I did eventually write the letter to my former self. And I said how important it was to have people who were in senior positions to inspire me. We didn't quite have the role models in Northern Ireland. In law, I had them personally and the people around me. I knew about Lady Hale when she came along and she was an inspiration. I knew about Ruth Bader Ginsburg in America and Sandra Day O'Connor, and they were inspirations. And there is this element of continuing to showcase the fact that I'm here and others are here to hopefully inspire you. I also said, if it's of any assistance to particularly the students in the room, in the letter, that I definitely worried too much when I was younger. I probably continue to do that, and it is better to have a confidence in yourself and to draw a line under things and to aim high, because what's the worst that can happen? So my connection with Queen's is strong in relation to this, and I am very confident that the university has gender diversity within law on the agenda. I suppose I'll come finally in the end of this picture to talk about judicial office holders, this short snapshot of where we are in Northern Ireland. So the broader picture in terms of judicial office holders statistically is that there has been a steadily increasing proportion of female judicial office holders in Northern Ireland over the past 15 years. Female judicial office holders are now in the majority when looking at overall figures, which again is broadly reflective of our societal makeup. However, and this is where the problem lies, which I think is across jurisdictions, in common with both branches of the legal profession, when the figures are broken down, the position is less encouraging when you get to senior judicial office holders' roles. So that's 21% in Northern Ireland. Now, I've talked about the pool of KCs increasing. I think the pool of partners and solicitors' firms is increasing. So once we increase the pool of people who want to go for judicial office, I think that will change. And there are non-traditional routes through the public sector. And, you know, we do have to be open-minded to other channels to get to judicial office. So whenever I came to think about the judiciary, I went through the process that's set up by our Judicial Appointments Commission. I'm now chair of that. And it is an open process, and it does its best to secure public confidence, look at merit, and try and appoint the best people, who should then filter through to be reflective of society. One practical step in relation to this is that we've tried to tailor the judicial profile for the different schemes that we're putting forward, because we don't want this to be a behemoth that people think is something to catch you out. It's supposed to showcase you. So I'm very much encouraging of everyone to try and step forward and see if judicial office is for you. that you can bring your skills, because it is important that we have a wide spread of people. So my trajectory is coming to an end in this address to you. I'm really very grateful for all of your attention and presence here today. I think coming back to what we've got in Northern Ireland, we are a small jurisdiction, but we, as one of my predecessors, Lord Kerr, said, punch above our weight in terms of the jurisprudence that we produce here. And I'm proud of that, and I think that continues to this day. And I think we do have an enormous reservoir of talent available in Northern Ireland, which we can tap into. We can do that in different ways, and we can support and nurture and recognise it and make changes in the next 100 years. I'm going to close with a few words from Sandra Day O'Connor, who you'll gather I admire. She encapsulated the importance of inspiring others to understand and value women's inclusion in law in order to forge a better world when she said, "Society as a whole benefits immeasurably from a climate in which all persons, regardless of race or gender, may have the opportunity to earn respect, responsibility, advancement, and remuneration based on ability." And that's what this is all about. Thanks very much.
I'm hoping this #1 mic doesn't need any buttons pressed. And so I tested it, you see. So I'm delighted to chair a little chat and conversation with our guests today, and we are joined by Sophie and Professor Aoife O'Donoghue as well. They're from Queen's University. I'm not going to spend a lot of time describing who you have in front of you, because the names that are on the screen, please take your time to read up about them, because I think it's such a special moment to have this group of people in front of you that I'd rather spend the time chatting rather than just introducing. But welcome, and welcome back to the Lady Chief Justice and Lady Hale. So I wanted to start actually with you, Sophie, because obviously we heard a lot about the trailblazing careers of, well, Lady Hale and the Lady Chief Justice. And I'm just interested, looking from your generation's point of view, what does it mean to you that they paved the way for your generation? How do you see the impact they've made for you and your aspiration?
I think coming into law and having these women before me, like Lady Hale, yours was the first name that I was aware of in law. Whenever I was in London for the first time in 2021, I made it my mission to go to the Supreme Court, and it was just amazing seeing that. And then with the Lady Chief Justice, just showing what women in Northern Ireland can do and what we're able to do, it really gives you a sense of like hope and confidence in the future, and that you can do what you put your mind to. And these women have shown, and they've fought, and just for us to continue that fight.
Oh, thank you. That's really wonderful. I'm not going to ask you to answer just yet, but I'm going to come to you, Aoife, because you have a very important role to play in that perception, I think, that I heard in both of the speeches before, because like you heard in my education when I was going for law school, I don't remember any name that wasn't a lord, because I was on the business track, so we didn't really stop on any of the family law, criminal. It was minimum. I went off to train in one of the Magic Circle law firms, so we had a very different approach to law, but there was no woman in my legal text. And that kind of, bridge of academia and teaching your students to go beyond maybe what the case law historically has passed on to them, to think beyond those names to other names. How do you, and also you are, following in the pioneering footsteps of the first woman professor. So how do you navigate that, and how do you feel that responsibility of bridging almost?
Well, it's interesting what you said about your own experience, because I think that's really important, that it's across, when we're in education, that it's across all areas. So we're very lucky we have an excellent gender in the law course at Queen's, which I've been very lucky to teach on. But it's equally important that in criminal law, in company law, that our reading lists, for instance, reflect that there are experts in those areas who the students should be reading, should be engaging. And if there isn't, that we point that out, that we point out that there's a gap, that there's a problem, and we say to the students, you could be that person, you could fill that gap. There's no reason, if you find this area interesting, this is that you can go into this. So I think it is important across all the areas of law that we make it clear and that we point out where, for instance, the case law might have a particular gendered outcome, like a gendered impact, where you can say, well, maybe if this issue was raised, or it could have been argued in another way, and that we point that out, that we bring that in, and that it just becomes a normal part of the conversation. And like academic work that has been done, but also the cases that have been written, when the case law is there that you can use, and obviously both Lady Hale and Lady Chief Justice are very important in that, and the cases that they have written, but also in the academic work, that it's there, that it's available, that we can show the students, and that it becomes normal to have those conversations as an essential part of how we teach, but also just a general part of what the law is and is about.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I think that is very much music to my ears, and maybe I'll go back to law school to read the new books. I'm just going to come to you, Lady Hale, because obviously you have paved the way and broke new ground, and you've made many a legal landmark for women in law. So looking back to those moments, but also looking forward, what do you think we can leave behind from your kind of experiences of how hard it was to break through? In terms of the next generation, what is it that maybe our fight's not fighting for?
That's a very difficult question, isn't it?
We only spent 12 hours together.
Yeah, because I feel that actually being a woman was very rarely a disadvantage in my career, because I came at just exactly the right point where there hadn't been many women, and a lot of people thought there ought to be more. So when I was appointed to the Law Commission, the law reform body, they hadn't had a woman, but they thought they ought to have one. So it was not a disadvantage to be a woman. And similarly, when I was appointed to the High Court, I said I was only the 10th ever, but they all thought they ought to have more. So we'll take a risk on Brenda. And it was a risk, because I had come through a different route. And similarly, in the House of Lords. So I don't want to claim that I had a particularly difficult time. I don't think I did. And looking to the future, I suspect that people will think, well, it's all been sorted. And, look at all the wonderful women in the room. Of course, there are also wonderful men in the room, but that's not what we're talking about. Yes, now the problems have all been solved, which is why I did point out all the evidence that there is that the problems have not been solved. And so I'm almost feeling sympathetic and encouraging to all the women in the room. Don't be put off by the problems. There's no reason to be put off by them. You just have to say, right, well, it's my business to solve them. And one of the things that I say to young people is that obviously you must take all the interesting opportunities that come your way. Just what you were saying about, well, if there's a gap in the literature because there isn't a woman writing about, shall we say, tax, although there are loads of women tax lawyers, but let's take the sort of thing that isn't thought of as a women's subject, but there are loads of them, go and fill the gap. So, yes, take the opportunities that come your way. And if you feel that possibly somebody has just offered it to you because they're conscious of the need for greater diversity and to tick a few boxes in their EDI record, never mind. give it your best shot, and if it doesn't happen to work out, it's their fault, not yours.
So now coming to you, Lady Chief Justice, in the spirit of learning from the past to change the future, which is very much the kind of arc that we focus on between the first 100 years and the next, what do you think are lessons learned that you would like to take forward, and which ones would you like to leave behind?
Right. Well, I think you've got great wisdom there from Lady Hale, may I say. Lessons learned are, I think, something that maybe hasn't been touched upon is this issue of sometimes called confidence gap that women have in terms of putting themselves forward for, promotion, or be that in a solicitor's firm, for silk, or to become a judge. I think we've all got to get over that. I have always believed that you should put yourself forward. It's not pushy to put yourself forward. Northern Ireland, we can be quite self-deprecating as well. I think that's quite nice in some respects, but we should be able to sell ourselves as lawyers on the basis of our ability. So I think one lesson is less reticence. The second lesson is, as I think I said in my address, to aim high. I mean, what is the worst that can happen on that? You can be disappointed, you try again, but you definitely learn from any experience that you take. I think the third lesson is that I think we do have to reflect on the fact, and I have reflected when I was sworn in as Lady Chief Justice, I said this, that there were a lot of women before me who were really talented, who didn't put themselves forward. It wasn't probably the right time. And I do remember them because even though they're unmapped, right, they're unknown, they're below the radar, they did something. They set something in train to think that, I could be where I am. So the third lesson is to remember. The fourth lesson is not to let up, I think, and to support each other in terms of going forward. And to, it's part of the point I raised about confidence gap, to be confident in your own ability as a lawyer, whether it is in company law or commercial law or family law, across the piece. What we're dealing with is equality and equality of opportunity. I think the final lesson is that you've got to remember as well that a lot of this conversation needs to come back to choice. I always get slightly worried whenever people think that you have to take a certain career trajectory. You don't. You can make choices to take time out to have a family, to go into the private sector, to work part-time, maybe to leave law and pick up your artistic side. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and women are not a homogenous group. We're not all the same. If you brought a set of women judges to a bench, it doesn't mean that the women are all going to decide in the same way. Far be it from that. So we're individuals. We're not just a homogenous group. And that's where, personal integrity comes into it, that you make your own choice. And you also make your own individual stamp on things. A really good example, I'm back to, by the way, Brenda, your book is brilliant, and I have read your book as well, but I'm back to talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day O'Connor. If you read their books, they came from totally different perspectives, both in terms of how they thought, both in terms of whether they viewed things in a conservative or liberal way. But they ultimately got on really well. They respected each other, and that's the way it should be. We're allowed to be different as women. Some of the most feminist people I know in the legal profession among my colleagues are men. And the men have helped me along the way. To all the men in the room, please, we're not sidelining you from this debate as well, because you're very important, and men, as well as women, did support me along the way. Sorry, Dana, that's a very long-winded way of answering the question. But
well, we are taking the men with us. We do like them to be involved, so definitely, please don't feel it's just women for women's sake, but, you know, to stay with us on this journey. I'd like to spend a bit more time on perception, because a recent study, I mean, we've heard that at entry level, we are a majority female profession. For the foreseeable future, the future of law is female. And yet, the recent survey among students aspiring to become solicitors, the women felt it wasn't a woman's place to be a lawyer. The female students, which was a surprise to me, because obviously the stats are telling a different story. So maybe we return a little bit to this perception that somehow women in the legal workplace maybe have no place, although we heard how successful we can be. So I wondered, when we look at that perception and how difficult it is to shift, if you like, the workplace and society in a kind of harmonious kind of tandem, we seem to be struggling. So what do you think we could do from a structural change point of view? And in fact, when we say change, it doesn't just mean because we've got some decision-making people here, but also in all of your parts. You probably have more power than you realize. From each of your vantage points, you know, let's start with the next generation. What change, one structural change, would you like to see in the legal profession that you hope to join, that you then makes you feel that you really belong and you can build that career? So what is the one change you think would change something for how you perceive yourself as a future lawyer? Sophie.
I think going back what was mentioned earlier about like the support for people wanting family life or that sort of thing, like whenever I was considering law and reading about it for like applying, I had read a book called In Black and White by Alexandra Wilson, and she had said about how like people were turned away from being barristers or put off it because whenever it came to having children, it was very hard to maintain that career. And it's the same across the legal profession, especially when it does come to like more senior roles and wanting to take on more responsibility. So I think with the build of like, as has been seen, especially whenever I've been looking towards law firms and stuff, the more hybrid approach, the more flexible working hours, the more support towards maternity, and making sure that women don't feel like they can only have a family life or only a career, that you can have both and be successful in your career while bringing up a family. So I think that's one thing that is encouraging to see, but also something that needs to be continuously emphasised and changed.
Well, thank you. So, Lady Hale, you obviously had a hand to play in some structural change, but if you had a magic wand for one structural change that would change things for how women perceive themselves in the legal profession?
Well, I want to echo everything that's just been said, with which I totally agree. But the one thing that I think could make a huge difference, not only to women and the culture of legal practice, can we get rid of billable hours, please? That would be good for the law, good for women, good for everybody. Can we work towards that, please?
It's a great call to action, I have to say. It's keeping a lot of people awake at night unnecessarily. Share the work. What about the academic world? Obviously, you know, the stats around women leaders and women professors is not great either in terms of, you know, academic practice. So how can we unlock the potential women in your area as well, but also how can that reverberate across the legal profession? What is the one change you would want to see?
Well, I think similarly in the sense of life, but I think the perception of law as always being an objective, rational, reasonable and legal education has a lot to do with that, because that's often how it's taught. So therefore, if you're emotional, if you see when things are unreasonable, if you are unreasonable, it's very rarely acceptable to be a woman and be unreasonable, or a woman and be emotional, or a woman who fights or is awkward or, you know, is rambunctious. Men can be individuals and be different, and I think that is connected to the way that we present law as some sort of like legal science almost. When it's made by people and it's adjudicated by people and it's people in the profession use it and operate it in every day. But women don't, because all the perceptions of what women are almost the opposite of the way that law itself is perceived. And I think from a legal education perspective, it's very important then that from the very beginning, people come in first year, that we make them aware of what law actually is, as opposed to some sort of idealized version of what the law is, and what a lawyer then, in its broadest idea of what a lawyer is then.
Yeah, absolutely. A lawyer that is not a female or a male, just a lawyer that creates a vision of something that is just not one sex, really, which is historically how it's been perceived. Try doing a search on stock photography and you'll be seeing what I mean. There'll never be a woman lawyer coming up if you put a lawyer search from an image point of view. So stereotypes abound still today, despite the majority in the profession. So coming to you, the Lady Chief Justice, the lady who has the power for one structural change.
Yeah.
Please, an exclusive for today.
Okay.
What is the next item?
I have one. I'm going to steal from my colleague in England and Wales, Baroness Carr. So her background legally is commercial and tech court. And she is quite attuned to the fact that there aren't enough women in that court. So she's drawing on her experience of that. The same applies in Northern Ireland in our commercial court. We have a female judge, the only other female High Court judge, Madam Justice McBride, in charge of that court. And what Baroness Carr thought of, which I haven't, for all the barristers in the room, I haven't put this in place yet if you're a junior. What she said is, the juniors should be sharing work within the court, because she noticed quite a lot of the juniors were female, but the seniors were male, and the juniors never got a speaking role. And if you don't have a speaking role, you're part of a team, but it's different. So I think that's a really interesting and good structural change. It can apply. I think the Supreme Court are thinking about it informally, if not formally, and it should happen in our courts. Now, I do remember on this, my days as a junior, you'd be terrified if you're not, if there was no pre-planning for this. I sit still wounded from the day when a senior turned round who hadn't given me any notice and said, you take the witness. Oh. But you know what? I did it, and I came out and I thought, right, I can do that now. But I think actually structurally a formal practice that is mandated by somebody like me in Northern Ireland or Baroness Carr in England and Wales to say all advocates should have a go, because that will lead to a greater and more obvious platform for advancement. And she's also, as you may have seen this week, said that solicitors should be thinking more about applying for high office from commercial practices, and that I think she's thinking about tapping into a reservoir there of men and females. So the bar, I will give you notice, but I'm thinking of it in Northern Ireland as a good idea to bring more women in to be advocates in the non-traditional areas.
Brilliant. I think we have some great ideas for change, and I hope it stirs your brains into thinking what you can do, each one of you. We're seeing you. So we're coming towards the end of our chat, and then we'll open for some questions from the floor. I just wanted to ask, we heard a little bit about role models and how inspirational they can be, and certainly I absolutely loved your story about your money handling, because I was the shopper in the family as well when I was about 7. Yeah. I was responsible for bread buying, and I was very good with change. It always turned into sweets. And then I would kind of persuade people why sweets were the right power tool, basically. So maybe, you create role models from different types of stories that you connect with. But I'm going to ask you the last question. I know you've given us a little bit of a hint, but each one of you, Who was your role model as you were looking ahead to build your career? So Lady Hill, you first.
Well, I always say that I had 3 female role models, the first of which was my mother, and I think an awful lot. A lot of the women owe a lot to their mothers. My mother trained as a teacher in the 1930s, but when she married my father in 1936, she had to give up teaching because there was a marriage bar in the teaching profession, and so she supported him when he became headmaster of a boarding school, and she looked after the boarding house, ran it with a rod of iron. And then he died very suddenly. And so she dusted off her teaching qualifications and got herself a full-time job as head teacher of the village primary school. Now, what about that for resilience, independence, maintaining the possibility of security? She did it for the sake of herself, but also mainly for her children. And so that's number 1 role model. I've already mentioned Rose Harbron, who was a role model for all of us on the Northern Circuit, despite the snide remarks there sometimes were about her. Because you'll remember that. There were snide remarks about her. Because she was brilliant and she was beautiful and she was successful, she actually did better than the men on the Northern Circuit. As a barrister defending murder cases, she was far more famous than they all were, so they were all jealous of her. So I think those are 2. That's enough, isn't it? I've probably got 3. But the third is a historic character who is Baroness Rhondda. Baroness Rhondda was actually the first woman president of the Institute of Directors. She was a very successful businesswoman, having run her father's businesses during the First World War. And she succeeded to his peerage, which had been deliberately created so that she could succeed to it as a woman. And then she applied to be allowed to sit in the House of Lords. And she was knocked back from that because the famous F.E. Smith, Lord Birkenhead, said, "Women are not merely disqualified from sitting in the House of Lords, they are incapacitated." And whereas disqualified people, like minors, can grow up and bankrupts can achieve their discharge and balmy people can get sane, a woman who is a woman must remain a woman all her life. So, a great fighter for women's equality. Those are my 3.
But unlike her, women today will not be left out of the right rooms, although she couldn't join.
There are still rooms out of which women are excluded.
Yeah, but
The best example in England, at least, is the Garrick Club, which has only just voted to admit women. And as it has a waiting list, it's going to be some time before all the women who might want to join that club can join it. Now, the point about the Garrick is, I don't want to join it at all. I never have wanted to join it. But the point about the Garrick is it's the closest club to the Royal Courts of Justice and the Inns of Court. So, although a lot of actors join it, so do a lot of barristers. And of course, that's where you pick up the gossip. That's where you learn who are the good guys and who are the not so good guys. That's where the Lord Chancellor's Department officials used to pick up the gossip to add to their secret dossiers on everybody. In other words, it was a networking opportunity. People wouldn't discuss work necessarily, but it was a networking opportunity that was open to them. So there are still things like that that are about that we have, I'm afraid, to try and protest about.
Thank you. Women have to be in all the rooms where decisions are made. I think that was what RBG said, and I totally subscribe to that. So any room that's still locked, we will bang on the door. Yeah. Next 100 years, won't have it. So I'm coming to you, Eva. Who is your role model in your life and career?
Well, I would actually, my mother is very important. So she back to the shop, and that she worked at a newsagent's. But I think because she always had her own political views, always had a very independent life, had her own set of friends. came from a very, very working class background, but it was a very independent, still is an extremely independent woman. But within the law, probably I would say Mary Robinson, because I grew up in Cork. And when she became president, because she was so vocal with her feminism, she became president. That speech when she accepted, when she won, she talked about Manana Heron, which means Women of Ireland. She talked about, rocking the world and not rocking the cradle. And she took some of the most critical cases around gender, around reproductive access, around LGBTQ, that as I grew older, like there was the moment when I was, in 1994, when I was very young, when she became president. But then as I kind of came on, I understood what an important legal figure she was as a Reed professor in Trinity, that she, and her career since, going to the UN, and I think it was not just all the things she achieved, but that she was willing to say, and I think it's very important, she was willing to say she was a feminist, and that she was fighting for women's rights in a time where the country I was growing up in was extremely conservative, and we didn't have bodily autonomy, and there wasn't divorce, and things were very, very difficult. And she was willing to take so much slack and was so resilient, because she's released the letters that she used to get when she was a senator, and they were just appalling, the things that she was called and the way she was treated. But the resilience that she demonstrated, even though she's very celebrated now and everyone thinks she's great, but there was a very, 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 very long period when she wasn't. And I think for me, as being very young when she became president, but I still remember her. I remember those speeches. I remember her being, this picture of her in her inauguration, and she's more or less surrounded by men. I think there's one other woman in the photograph, and she's there very brightly dressed, sitting in the middle, surrounded by all these former judges and Taoiseach and presidents. I think she's such a significant, I think for a lot of women of my generation, she was this extremely significant and still is, because she's still out there fighting for climate change and to make things better. So, Mary Robinson, I think.
Well, it's a great example of a woman that went beyond law and used law in other parts of society, which I think is also a great message to women coming through the legal system, that your job is not just in law, but you can go beyond law and still make change. So that's a really great example. Lady Chief, you have mentioned a few names. Are there any other names that you haven't shared with us of a role model that shaped you?
Yeah, I actually think it's only now, reflecting back, that I realise who the role models were for me, in particular my aunt. So the reason why I say my aunt is she went to UCD in the 1950s to study maths, and that was pretty rare at that time for a woman to go, and she was brilliant at maths. She was the only person who, I think traditionally in the structure that prevailed in a family of four that was educated, so she was actually the girl. So as you've heard, I was brought up by my parents who ran a shop. My dad was sort of put into the shop, although he was very bright as well. But anyway, Mary went to UCD. She studied maths. She became a teacher in a grammar school in Newry, and by all accounts did very well. But then she was offered a job in another school, which was an up-and-coming school, which was not for the most academically gifted students in an outlying town, but it was showcasing practical skills and sport. And they did really well at sport, although I do remember I went to the school in Warrenpoint and I was playing camogie for the school that I went to. And Mary came out to watch, and of course I was goalkeeper. I let in about 10 goals that day, so I was very embarrassed. But she went on to become principal of the school. And, I didn't quite realise at the time how formative that was for me. But my last sort of point about her is I realised how important she was for other people, for people she educated whenever she passed away. And, I was trying to organise the wake. And all these young men, mostly young men, came to the wake. And they were colourful characters, some of them, but they told me, oh, you see your Aunt Mary, she got me through my maths GCSE because I was really not very good. So she really made a difference, not lauded, not known, not famous. And I now know that it was a role modelling for me. I don't think I realised it fully at the time, but I now know it was. So, my Aunt Mary.
Well, thank you. And also it shows that leadership run through the family, can I say?
Yeah.
So it's all in the genes. And Sophie, who is the role model that's guiding you for the future?
So I think from a personal perspective, I have to say my mum as well. She inspires me every day, is so hardworking, resilient, has so much faith and like support in me no matter what I'm doing. I sometimes fall victim to I maybe shouldn't do this, or maybe I'm not made for this, and she always like, Sophie, basically, wise up, you've got this. And then obviously mentioned the two ladies beside me have been such inspirations and incredible, and they've left such an impact for the present and future women in law. But I think from my legal education, a big role model for me within the law school has been one of my lecturers, Dr. Nora Burns. I was so fortunate to meet her really early on in my first year when I was so overwhelmed with the changes and what was university going to be like, and it was so daunting. But she genuinely cares about her students. She's an incredible academic. You leave the room feeling so confident and ready to take on the world, and she's really shaped my legal education and my legal career in the future. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. That's wonderful. Really very inspiring to hear each one of yours and your role models. And now I will open for a few questions. Please, when you get the mic, there are a couple of mics roaming after you put your hand up. Do say who you are and where you work, and keep your questions very brief so we can get more questions and more answers. So who's first? Because we'd love a first.
Hi, my name's Aoife. I work in Tuin Solicitors in City Centre here. I think it was touched upon earlier that there is a confidence gap, I think, between men and women generally. And I think that can act as a bit of a double-edged sword when you're a junior. So drawing on your own, I suppose, journey in law so far, what resources did you draw upon to give you that confidence, to put yourself forward for opportunities, to, I suppose, speak your opinion when you think it might need weight given to it?
I just did it. I don't know where that came from, but I just did it. I was never afraid to be wrong if I said something, but I wanted to be heard in the room. And I think it takes a bit of bravery, doesn't it, sometimes, if you're the junior in the room. Interestingly, this whole issue came out in something called reverse mentoring, which I think is really important, which is the youngest and most junior people in offices or at the bar mentoring the more senior people, to get the more senior people to realise that they can't not turn to the junior person to ask for their opinion, and that it's valuable, and that they feel on the fringe as if they don't contribute. But when you have that, your heart's racing and you think, I have a great idea, right, I need to say it. And you're probably too nervous the first time you don't say it, and the man in the room says it, and everybody says, God, that's a fantastic idea. Well, you need to go home and think, I'm going to be braver the next time. I'm going to say it. I personally I don't know, I just got it from an early age that I was not afraid to speak up, but I understand it can be very difficult, and I think you have to actually practice it. And the first time that you get the sort of tick that you've got the idea, you're flying then. But there shouldn't really be a confidence gap, because I do think it's down to individuals, because there are men out there who are equally, might have a confidence problem as women. So you have to be brave on it. That's just from my own experience.
Would anybody else like to add a different perspective? No. Any other questions? Here.
Good morning. My name's Sasha Conlon. I have a private practice background, but I'm actually now in-house counsel as of the last 6 months or so for a company called Rapid 7. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you so much for your insights this morning from all of the panelists. I think I speak for everybody in the room when I say it's amazing to hear from so many brilliant legal minds who are women who inspire all of us. So it has just been a delight to be here this morning. I think the question I would have for anybody on the panel, who maybe wants to sort of address it, but I think today we've talked a lot about how every day we as women are better and better at advocating for ourselves in spaces where we are maybe the minority or maybe, feeling slightly overshadowed. So I think that the question I would have is, what takeaways do you think that men can have from these sorts of discussions for moving forward in the future? Because we are always going to advocate for ourselves as women, but I think men have a really important role to play in that conversation as well. So in your view, what insights do you think men can kind of take away from this event today and sort of legal feminism in general? Thank you.
It's a great question. Shall we start with you, Lady Howe?
Well, thank you very much indeed. I think we women have always understood that we would never have got anywhere if it hadn't been for the support of men who got it. And this was true from the vote, through public office, to joining the professions and everything. So there have always been men there who really did get it. And I imagine most of the men in the room have already got it. So how do we get out to the ones who haven't got it? I think that's a problem. And I don't know the answer to that. I do also know that one of the answers to being able to have a successful career and a fulfilling family life is to choose the right partner, male or female, but the right partner is an important part of that. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who's been mentioned several times already, is a wonderful woman, said the best decision of her life was to marry Marty, because Marty was one of those men who were not afraid of clever women. My husband was one of those men who are not afraid of clever women. So you must find a man who is not, if you want a man, who is, because that's not compulsory, who is not afraid of clever women. And so that's the lesson I think men should learn. Don't be afraid of clever women. We're not a threat. We'll also support you in everything you do, which is an important part of being a partner. So, right. Message to men. Don't be afraid of clever women.
That's great. I'm going to come to you, Sophie, very briefly, because obviously it's a generational difference as well, and studies are showing this divide and gap in kind of communication between young men and young women really expanding around lots of value systems, really. And I wonder how do you advocate in your generation to make men understand you're there not to be a threat, but actually you are, if you like, lifting everybody with you at a good level of quality?
I think a big thing is a lot of men just maybe aren't conscious of the barriers maybe that women have, or like whenever you're in a room speaking, that maybe like men would feel more confident being the first one to speak, and then it's women are going to speak but they've just been overpowered or whatever it is. Just consciousness of like the differences, because I don't think quite a lot of it is malicious. I think it just is they're not aware. So like making them more as I said, conscious of there are gaps and there are barriers that women are still facing, even if we might not shout about it. And just, I think we are in a very good place where, like, as we can see with the men in the room, they are willing to support women and we aren't a threat, as said. And yeah, I think it just is making them aware that there are these little barriers and just the consciousness.
Thank you. I'm going to have to close now, but I'll say one thing. My husband, when I started the first 100 years, because he's a barrister, I sent him to Gray's Inn Library to research all the first women that I identified, and I didn't have any way of researching them, and he did obey. And the first, and the first 100 years would not have actually built up as quickly if it hadn't been for him actually showing curiosity. And a lot of the stories I tested on him. And one way in which I connected with some of the men in the legal profession was through this storytelling. They were just curious about all these women that had done so many interesting things, so many interesting cases. They had been so brilliant in their job. They were inspired and really in awe at them as opposed to womanhood, generally speaking. So I found storytelling was a very good way, by testing it on the man at home, a good way to cut through to them when maybe they think, well, it's a woman's room with women talking about women things. And actually, we were talking about the legal profession, the impact of professionals in the profession, and women were part of that. So I think we tried, and that was the kind of spirit of the first 100 years, was to change the narrative around gender for gender's sake, but put it in a historic context to see contribution, value, reward, all of that, but actually make it interesting and make it, storytelling being a really critical way to do it. So tell more stories and make people connect with it emotionally speaking, because that's how we are as humans. I'm going to stop right now and say a big thank you to, Lady Hale, the Lady Chief Justice, Sophie, and Ife, and also to all of you for being so well behaved and so kind and nice, and for all being here in this weather that is very cold. So thank you very much. And also to invite Michael Neal to come and address you, and he is from NL Goodbody, and thank you so much for everybody's support and for making it happen.
Good morning, everyone. Before I bring proceedings to a close, I was just listening to the question about role models. And as you do, you tend to reflect yourself. And like all of you, and I suspect like many in the room, I had three role models too. One was my mother. But the other two were partners in law firms, female partners in law firms. One was a partner in a commercial law firm in Belfast. And the second was a partner in a London law firm in London. One is now a district judge in Northern Ireland, and one is just retired after 35 years in a city firm. But when I was reflecting about that, and those were the female role models in my life, I had a little regret, which is I've never actually told them that they were my role models. And I think from today, that's something I'm going to do. And I just wonder, do we tell people enough how influential and valuable they've been in our lives? But as I said, I'm going to bring proceedings to a close, and I'm sure I speak for us all when I say how much we've enjoyed listening to each one of our speakers, and indeed to the panel discussion. And there really can be no doubt, I believe, that progress has been made over the last 100 years, maybe in particular over the last 10 years, more than the 90 years before that. But we should also be mindful that there remains much work to do in the years ahead. And as you've said, Lady Hale, the problems aren't solved. They're not yet solved. There's still much work to do. And so whilst it's our responsibility to advance equality, diversity and inclusion within the legal profession, and I might add, at all levels, that's where the work needs to happen. I think it's imperative that we just don't see it as a responsibility, and rather we see it in addition as an opportunity. Because all aspects of law, whether that be from the bar, the judiciary, public sector, or indeed private sector law firms, are so much stronger when they reflect the diversity within society itself. And as a corporate law firm, NL Goodbody is at its core a people business. We have 1,000 people across Belfast and Dublin, but it's a fact that over 2/3 are women. And therefore, comes with that a huge responsibility for me to work on the areas that we need to work on. And it's therefore a privilege for us, with so many women within our firm, to support and to celebrate an event like this, listening to some trailblazing women leaders in law. And so we leave here today optimistic and inspired about what the next 100 years might hold for women in law. So in closing, I'd like to thank our speakers again, to all of you for attending, for Danske Bank and to Queen's for partnering with us in supporting today. Thank you.